when he bought a snow-buried castle for $800. Everyone said the injured veteran was crazy, but deep beneath its frozen floors lay a secret tunnel network containing $215 million that would change everything. Before we explore this incredible journey, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The February wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying snow so thick it turned the world into a white void. Marcus Sullivan sat in his beat-up Ford pickup, engine rattling against the cold, staring through the windshield at something that shouldn't exist. Rising from the drifted snow like a forgotten dream stood a castle, not a mansion someone called a castle, but an actual stone fortress with turrets, battlements, and walls thick enough to stop a tank. He checked the address on his phone again. This was it, the auction listing that had caught his eye 3 weeks ago, while scrolling through government surplus sites at 2 a.m, another sleepless night in his studio apartment. Historic stone structure, 10 acres, starting bid $500. No photos, no description beyond needs work, and a location so remote the GPS had given up halfway up the mountain road. Marcus stepped out into the storm, his prosthetic left leg immediately protesting the uneven terrain beneath the snow. Each step sent a familiar ache through what remained of his thigh, a constant reminder of the IED that had ended his army career 2 years ago in Afghanistan. The explosion had taken his leg below the knee, 3 of his closest friends, and any sense that the world made logical sense anymore, but he'd learned to push through physical pain. It was the emptiness afterward, the hollow echo where his purpose used to be, that nearly killed him. The wind whipped his dark hair across his scarred face as he approached the massive wooden doors. They were 12 feet tall, iron-bound, and looked like they belonged in a medieval fortress, not buried in a Colorado snowdrift. Heavy iron hinges, black with age, held them in place against stone walls that seemed to grow directly from the mountain itself. A heavy chain held them shut, but the padlock was modern, cheap, and already rusted from mountain weather. Marcus had driven 8 hours from Denver with $800 in cash, the last of his disability check after rent and groceries. He'd been living in a studio apartment near the VA hospital, watching his savings disappear faster than his will to keep fighting the nightmares that visited every time he closed his eyes. The VA therapist, a well-meaning woman who'd never heard a mortar round in her life, said he needed purpose, something to rebuild around. When he saw this listing buried in a government auction site, something deep in his chest had stirred for the first time since the explosion. He tried the smaller side door, noting how its medieval appearance was perfectly preserved, despite decades of mountain weather. It opened with a groan that echoed across the empty peaks, the sound swallowed by falling snow. Inside, the silence was cathedral deep, thick with the weight of years and secrets. His footsteps echoed off stone walls as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through narrow windows, designed more for defense than illumination. The great hall stretched before him like something from a fever dream. Vaulted ceiling, disappearing into shadows 30 feet above, supported by hand-carved beams that belonged in a European cathedral. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, big enough for a man to stand inside, its chimney rising into darkness. Tapestries hung along the walls, faded but intact, depicting scenes of medieval life that seemed impossible in the American West. But it was the condition that shocked him most. Everything was intact. No vandalism, no copper stripped from the walls, no evidence of squatters or drug users, no broken windows, no graffiti, no sign that modern vandalism had ever touched this place. Dust covered everything like a burial shroud, but beneath it, the craftsmanship was breathtaking. Hand-carved stone moldings framed doorways. Intricate stonework formed arches that belonged in pictures of European castles. This wasn't just a building, it was art frozen in time. Marcus walked deeper into the structure, his military-issued cane tapping against stone floors worn smooth by footsteps that should have been centuries old. Room after room revealed the same impossible preservation. It was as if everyone had simply walked away one day and never returned. Furniture sat covered in white sheets that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Books lined shelves in what looked like a library, their leather spines cracked but readable. Paintings hung on walls, their subjects barely visible through years of dust, but clearly valuable, clearly old, clearly waiting. In what must have been a kitchen, massive cast-iron stoves sat cold but ready, their surfaces free of rust despite the mountain humidity. Copper pots hung from hooks, tarnished but undamaged. A cellar door stood slightly ajar, revealing stone steps that disappeared into darkness below. Marcus made a mental note to explore that later, if the place somehow became his. He climbed a winding stone staircase to the second floor, each step worn smooth by countless feet. The banister was carved from a single piece of oak, polished by generations of hands. Each level revealed more of the same mysterious preservation: bedrooms with 4-poster beds that looked ready for guests, bathrooms with clawfoot tubs and fixtures that belonged in museums, windows that looked out over an empire of snow-covered peaks, not another building visible in any direction. At the top of the highest tower, he found a circular room with windows facing every direction. The view was breathtaking, endless mountains stretching to the horizon like God's own fortress walls. Up here, the wind sang through stone crenellations with a sound that was both haunting and beautiful. Marcus stood at one of the tall windows, looking out over wilderness that seemed untouched since the world began, and felt something he hadn't experienced since before the explosion: possibility. His phone buzzed, the sound jarring in the ancient silence. A text from the auctioneer: "Bidding starts in 1 hour. You still coming?" Marcus typed back with numb fingers, "On my way." As he walked back through the castle toward the main entrance, questions multiplied in his mind. Who built this? When? How had something this magnificent remained hidden in the Colorado mountains? Why was it being auctioned for pocket change? And why did every room feel like it was waiting for something, as if the castle itself was holding its breath? The auction was held in the parking lot of a gas station 20 miles down the mountain, the only flat space large enough for the handful of vehicles that showed up. 3 other people arrived despite the storm. A local rancher in a Carhartt jacket looking for cheap grazing land. A young couple from Boulder who left after learning about the access road conditions, and an elderly man in an expensive overcoat who studied the legal documents with the intensity of someone who'd done this before. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who'd rather be anywhere else, kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. Snow collected on his clipboard as he read from official-looking papers. "All right, folks, let's get this over with. We've got a 1913 stone structure, approximately 12,000 square feet, sitting on 10.7 acres. Property's been in probate for 18 months. Estate wants it gone. No utilities, no access maintenance. Buyer responsible for all inspections and repairs. Starting bid is $500. The rancher raised his hand first. $500. $600, said the elderly man, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Marcus's heart pounded. He'd driven all this way with $800, but suddenly that seemed woefully inadequate. The elderly man had the look of someone who'd come prepared to spend serious money. $700, the rancher countered, though his voice carried less conviction now. The elderly man studied Marcus with pale blue eyes that missed nothing, taking in the military bearing, the prosthetic leg, the determined set of his jaw. Then he looked back at the auctioneer and said, $800. Silence stretched across the parking lot, like a held breath. Wind howled through the pines, and snow continued to fall on the small group gathered around the auctioneer's truck. The rancher shook his head and walked back to his vehicle, clearly unwilling to bid against someone who looked like he had deeper pockets. The auctioneer looked at Marcus. "You in or out, son?" Marcus felt the weight of every eye on him. $800 was everything he had. If he bid and lost, he'd be broke until next month's disability check arrived. If he didn't bid, he'd go back to that empty apartment and continue the slow slide toward whatever came after hope ran out. But something about the castle had awakened something in him, something that felt like purpose for the first time since the explosion. 850, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The elderly man's smile wasn't pleasant. It was the expression of a predator who'd just spotted weakness. 1,000. Marcus's mouth went dry. The man had just priced him out with the casual ease of someone swatting a fly. He started to lower his hand when something made him pause. The way the old man was watching him, like he was studying a specimen under glass. The expensive coat in a place where expensive people didn't usually come. The fact that he'd known exactly how much to bid to shut Marcus out without going higher than necessary. This felt orchestrated, like the man had known what Marcus could afford and bid just enough to eliminate him. 1,200, Marcus said, knowing he didn't have it. The elderly man's smile vanished. He studied Marcus again, this time with something that might have been respect or calculation. 1,500, Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't have 1,500, he barely had 800, but something about this felt important in a way he couldn't explain. He thought about the castle, about the way it had felt to walk through those halls, about the view from the tower window, about the sense that he was meant to be there. "I need to make a call," he said. He walked away from the group, boots crunching in the snow, and dialed his sister Sarah in California. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the concern she'd carried since he came back from the war. "Marcus, everything okay?" "Sarah, I need to borrow $700. Silence. Then, "For what?" "I'm trying to buy a castle." "You're trying to buy a what?" He explained quickly, knowing how it sounded but unable to stop himself. His sister had been sending him money for months, helping with therapy costs and rent, never asking for it back, never making him feel like charity. She'd never asked for more details about how he was spending her help, trusting him to figure out his path back to something resembling a life. "Marcus," she said gently, "maybe this isn't the best time for major purchases. You're still recovering, still figuring things out. Sarah, please. I can't explain why, but this feels important, really important. Like maybe the first important thing I've felt since." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Another pause, filled with the sound of wind and his own heartbeat. "How much exactly?" 700, maybe 8, to be safe." "Okay," she said without hesitation. "But Marcus, I'm worried about you." "I know. Thank you. I'll pay you back. That's not what I'm worried about." He walked back to the group, where the elderly man was talking quietly on his phone, probably arranging his own financing. Marcus waited until he finished, snow collecting on his shoulders. 1,600, Marcus said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. The man looked genuinely surprised now, then annoyed. Whatever calculation he'd been making had been disrupted. 2,000. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Sarah had agreed to 700, not 1,200, but something in the man's expression had changed. The smooth confidence was gone, replaced by irritation. Maybe he wasn't used to being challenged. Maybe he hadn't expected a broke veteran to fight this hard for something that seemed worthless to everyone else. 2,500, Marcus said, praying his voice wouldn't crack. The elderly man stared at him for a long moment, his pale eyes, calculating something Marcus couldn't read. Then he closed his phone, walked to his car without another word, and drove away down the mountain road. The auctioneer looked confused by the sudden departure. Going once for 2,500, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the Ford. Marcus's knees went weak. He'd just bought a castle, with money he didn't have, for reasons he couldn't fully explain to himself, let alone anyone else. An hour later, he stood in the great hall again, this time holding a set of keys that looked like they belonged in a medieval museum. Heavy iron, worn smooth by countless hands, they felt warm in his palm despite the cold. The silence felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for him to bring it back to life, to fill its rooms with purpose again, to justify the faith Sarah had shown in lending him money for what must have seemed like madness. But as he walked through the rooms again, now as their owner rather than a curious visitor, details he'd missed before began to emerge. The books in the library were in multiple languages: German, French, Italian, some he couldn't identify. The paintings on the walls, beneath their coating of dust, showed subjects and techniques that seemed older than the castle itself. And everywhere, subtle signs that this place had been built not just as a home but as something else, something that required thick walls, hidden passages, rooms that could be sealed off from the outside world. He walked to the cellar door he'd noticed earlier and pulled it fully open. Stone steps led down into darkness so complete his phone's flashlight barely penetrated it. The air that rose from below was different from the rest of the castle, drier, cooler, and carrying a scent he couldn't identify. Not mold or decay, but something almost metallic, like old coins or machinery that hadn't run in decades. Marcus descended carefully, his cane tapping against each step that seemed to go deeper than any normal basement should. The stairs went at least 20 feet below ground level, carved from solid rock with the same precision as the castle above. At the bottom, his light revealed a vaulted stone ceiling and walls that stretched beyond the reach of his beam. But it was what covered the walls that made him stop breathing entirely. Maps. Dozens of them, pinned to wooden boards and covered with transparent sheets to preserve them from moisture and time. Not modern maps, but hand-drawn ones with careful annotations in multiple languages. Some showed the local mountains, but with features and markings that didn't match anything he'd seen on current surveys. Others depicted what looked like floor plans, tunnels, passages, underground chambers that seemed to extend for miles beneath the mountain. In the center of the room sat a heavy wooden table, its surface covered with more papers held down by glass weights. Marcus approached carefully, as if the documents might crumble at his touch. The top sheet was a letter, written in faded ink, with the careful penmanship of someone for whom writing was an art. If you are reading this, then the Steinberg Family Trust has finally passed beyond our ability to maintain the property. We pray that whoever follows will understand the weight of what lies beneath these mountains and the responsibility that comes with it. The maps are accurate as of June 1947. The passages remain sealed. The contents remain intact. May God forgive us for what we preserved and grant wisdom to whoever must decide its fate. Heinrich Steinberg, June 19, 1947. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding harder with each pass. Contents, passages. What exactly had he bought? He looked closer at the maps, studying them with the attention to detail the army had drilled into him. They showed a network of tunnels radiating out from directly beneath the castle, some extending for miles into the mountains. Some chambers were marked with German text he couldn't read, but others had notes in English. Storage Level A, Preservation Chamber B, 7, Primary Vault Access. One map showed the castle itself, but with details that didn't match what he'd seen above ground. According to this, there should be hidden doors, concealed staircases, passages between walls. The cellar where he stood was marked as entry level only. Below it, the map showed at least 3 more levels, each larger than the last, connected by what looked like a small railroad system. Marcus studied the walls more carefully, running his hands along the stones. What he'd taken for solid construction wasn't quite right. In one corner, the mortar between stones looked different, newer, cleaner. He pressed against it and felt it give slightly. He pushed harder, and a section of wall swung inward like a door on silent hinges, revealing a passage beyond. The air that rushed out was warmer, with that metallic scent much stronger now. Marcus shone his light into the passage and saw something that defied belief. It was clearly man-made, carved from solid rock with incredible precision. The walls were smooth as glass, the ceiling arched for structural strength. This wasn't a natural cave or simple root cellar. This was engineering that belonged in textbooks. work that would have required teams of experts and equipment that shouldn't have existed in 1947. He hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling him to stop, to go back upstairs, to call someone. But who? And tell them what? That he'd bought a castle with secret tunnels. That he'd found maps suggesting something vast was hidden beneath a Colorado mountain? Marcus stepped into the passage, his footsteps echoing differently here, as if the space beyond was enormous. After 30 feet, the passage opened into a chamber that stole what was left of his breath. The ceiling soared 20 feet above his head, supported by stone arches that belonged in a cathedral, but it was what filled the chamber that made him lean against the wall for support. Crates. Hundreds of wooden crates, stacked floor to ceiling along every wall. Each one was marked with numbers and German text, but some had English translations written below in the same careful handwriting as Heinrich's letter. Textiles, metalwork, documents, art objects, precious items. Marcus approached the nearest crate with the reverence of someone entering a tomb. It was sealed, but not locked. The wood was old but solid, held together with metal bands that hadn't rusted despite decades underground. He found a loose board on one side and pried it back just enough to see inside. Wrapped in what looked like silk, something gleamed in his flashlight beam. He reached in carefully and extracted it. Heavy, cold, ornate, a golden chalice covered in gems that sparkled like captured fire. Even in the dim light, he could see it was old, valuable, and absolutely beautiful. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The kind of work that took months to complete and belonged in the greatest museums of the world. He rewrapped it carefully and replaced it in the crate, his hands shaking. He looked around the chamber with new understanding. This wasn't just storage, this was a treasure vault. A collection of artifacts so valuable that someone had carved rooms from solid mountain to hide them from the world. But why? And who was Heinrich Steinberg? Why had he preserved all this? And why had he left it for whoever came next to decide its fate? As he turned to leave, his light caught something that made him freeze. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden behind the largest crates, was another passage. This one was different, wider, with rails set into the floor like a small-gauge railroad. The tracks disappeared into darkness, heading deeper into the mountain. Marcus checked his phone. He'd been underground for over an hour, and the battery was getting low. He needed to get back to the surface, process what he'd found, make plans. But as he walked back through the passage toward the cellar, one thought kept repeating in his mind like a mantra. If Heinrich Steinberg had stored treasure in the first chamber, what was he shipping deeper into the mountain on those railroad tracks? By the time Marcus emerged from the cellar, the winter sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and gold. He stood in his great hall still holding the keys to his castle, still trying to process what he'd discovered beneath its foundations. He wasn't just a broke veteran living in a studio apartment anymore. He was the owner of what might be the greatest secret in North America. But with that realization came weight, the same weight Heinrich Steinberg had written about in his letter. Whatever was down there, someone had died protecting it. Someone had carved miles of tunnels, moved countless artifacts, and sealed it all away for more than 70 years. Now, it belonged to him. And he had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Marcus didn't sleep that first night in the castle. He'd driven back to Denver in a daze, his mind racing between disbelief and a growing certainty that his life had just changed forever. He sat in his studio apartment, surrounded by the few possessions that had survived his post-war downsizing, and stared at the photographs he'd managed to take before his phone died. The golden chalice gleamed from the screen, impossible and real. The maps spread across Heinrich's table showed a network of passages that boggled the mind. And somewhere deeper in the mountain, railroad tracks led to chambers he hadn't even begun to explore. He called Sarah at midnight, waking her up. "Marcus, what's wrong?" "I bought the castle." "Okay, how was it?" "Sarah, there's something underneath it, something big." He tried to explain without sounding insane. The cellar, the maps, the treasure chamber, the railroad tracks disappearing into darkness. His sister listened without interrupting, which meant she was either very concerned or very skeptical. "Marcus," she said finally, "I need you to be careful. If what you're saying is true, if there's really valuable stuff hidden there, other people are going to want it. People with lawyers and resources and fewer scruples than you. I know. That's why I'm calling. I need help figuring this out legally. What are my rights? What am I required to report? What if this stuff belongs to someone else? I'll make some calls in the morning, but Marcus, promise me you won't go back there alone." "Not until we know more about what you're dealing with," he promised, but they both knew he was lying. The next morning, Marcus loaded his truck with supplies, industrial flashlights, a camera with extra batteries, food, water, basic tools, rope, and a first aid kit. He'd also stopped at an army surplus store and bought a satellite communicator, a device that could send emergency signals even from deep underground. The drive back to the castle took 3 hours through winding mountain roads, still treacherous with ice from the previous day's storm. The world looked different in the clear morning light, crystalline and sharp, as if the snow had washed away everything unnecessary and left only the essential bones of the landscape. The castle looked even more impossible against the blue sky, its towers and battlements sharp as knife edges. He parked close to the main entrance and unloaded his gear methodically. This time, he planned to document everything systematically. Whatever Heinrich Steinberg had hidden down there, Marcus was going to catalog it properly before anyone else got involved. The cellar felt different in the full beam of a professional flashlight. The maps on the walls revealed details he'd missed in his initial exploration. Heinrich's annotations were meticulous, marking not just locations but dates, contents, and what looked like priority codes. Some chambers were marked with red ink, others with blue or green. The organizational system was complex, professional, and clearly the work of someone who understood the value of what he was protecting. Marcus photographed every map, paying special attention to the passages marked with railroad symbols. According to Heinrich's annotations, the main tunnel system extended over 2 miles into the mountain, with branches leading to 7 separate vault areas. The depth markings showed the tunnels went down at least 4 levels, with the deepest chambers more than 200 feet below the castle's foundation. He studied Heinrich's letter again, looking for clues he'd missed. The date, June 19, 1947, was just 2 years after the end of World War II. The German text, the careful preservation methods, the sense of urgency in Heinrich's words, pieces of a puzzle he began forming in Marcus's mind. What if Heinrich Steinberg hadn't been hiding personal treasure? What if he'd been hiding something else entirely? Something that required this level of secrecy, this depth of engineering, this elaborate system of preservation and documentation. Marcus gathered the maps he'd need and headed for the hidden passage. This time, he came prepared. He'd brought chalk to mark his route, extra batteries for everything, emergency food, and a small video camera that could record in low light. If he was going to explore a secret tunnel system carved into a mountain, he was going to do it right. The first chamber looked different under powerful lighting. The crates weren't just stacked randomly. They were organized according to some complex system, numbers, letters, categories that suggested careful inventory control. Marcus examined several more carefully, finding similar treasures, artwork wrapped in protective cloth, jewelry stored in custom-fitted cases, religious artifacts cushioned in silk. Each item showed the same extraordinary care in preservation, but it was the railroad tunnel that called to him now. He followed the tracks deeper into the mountain, documenting everything with the methodical approach the army had drilled into him. The tunnel was a marvel of engineering, perfectly straight for the first quarter mile, then curving gently to follow the natural contours of the mountain. The rails themselves were small gauge, but professionally installed, with proper ballast and drainage systems. Whoever had built this hadn't been amateurs. This was work that required expertise, planning, and resources that seemed impossible for a private individual in the 1940s. After following the tracks for half a mile, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one even larger than the first. But instead of crates, it was filled with machinery that made Marcus stop and stare. Generators, pumps, air filtration systems, climate controls, and sitting in one corner, covered by a tarp, what looked like early electrical equipment that might have been a primitive computer system. Marcus's engineering background from his army days kicked in as he examined the equipment. Everything was designed for long-term operation in an underground environment. Climate control to keep the air dry and temperature stable, emergency power systems with backup batteries, water filtration, and air purification that could support people for extended periods. This wasn't just storage, it was infrastructure. Someone had built a complete underground facility capable of supporting a significant operation for years without outside contact. Marcus found a control panel near the center of the chamber and managed to trace the wiring back to a massive diesel generator system. With some work, he might be able to restore power to at least part of the facility. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. What would he find if he could light up the entire underground network? He followed the tracks further, discovering branch passages marked with signs in both German and English. Administrative section, research laboratory, archive storage, personal quarters, security station. This wasn't just a treasure vault or even a simple hiding place. This was an underground complex, a facility designed to house and support a complete operation. The administrative section revealed the scope of what Heinrich had built. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal drawers filled with documents in multiple languages. Marcus found personnel records, supply manifests, construction blueprints, correspondence, financial records, and operational reports, dating from 1943 to 1947. As he read through the files, the picture became clearer and more incredible with each document. Heinrich Steinberg hadn't just been hiding artifacts. He'd been running a sophisticated operation involving dozens of people across multiple countries. The documents revealed a network of scholars, scientists, artists, refugees, and even some military personnel who had used this mountain facility as headquarters for something called Project Preservation. The mission statement, written in Heinrich's careful handwriting and signed by 17 other people, was breathtaking in its scope. To safeguard the cultural and intellectual heritage of Europe from the destruction of war and the chaos that follows, preserving for future generations the knowledge, art, and memory that define human civilization. But it was more than noble intentions. As Marcus dug deeper into the operational files, he found evidence of something unprecedented in scale and sophistication. Heinrich and his team hadn't just been collecting random treasures, they'd been systematically recovering and preserving artifacts, documents, and knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. Art stolen by Nazis and never returned to families. Scientific research confiscated by various armies and buried in bureaucracy. Religious texts hidden to prevent destruction during pogroms and purges. Personal treasures smuggled out by refugees who never lived to reclaim them. Academic libraries destroyed by bombing, their contents rescued book by book. The scope was staggering. According to the files, Project Preservation had operated teams in Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Rome, Prague, and even Cairo. They had contacts in refugee camps, connections with underground resistance networks, and arrangements with sympathetic officials in multiple governments. All of it coordinated from this hidden facility in the Colorado mountains. Marcus found detailed maps showing safe houses, transportation routes, and storage facilities across Europe. Communication logs revealed coded messages between operatives in different cities. Financial records showed funding that came from Swiss banks, American benefactors, and the sale of duplicates or less significant items to support the larger mission. What happens next will reveal the true scope of Heinrich's operation, uncover secrets that governments have searched for decades, and show Marcus discoveries that will change everything he thought he knew about history. Stay tuned to see what he finds in the deepest levels. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The research laboratory confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that this operation was far more sophisticated than simple treasure collecting. Room after room contained equipment that belonged in major universities, chemical analysis stations, microscopes, document preservation apparatus, photographic development labs, even what looked like early X-ray equipment for examining artwork and artifacts without damage. Marcus found logbooks detailing the scientific process Heinrich's team had followed. Each item that came through the facility was photographed from multiple angles, analyzed for authenticity and condition, chemically tested to determine proper preservation methods, and catalogued with detailed provenance documentation. The care taken was extraordinary. These people understood they were preserving history itself, and they'd applied scientific rigor to every step of the process. But it was in Heinrich's personal office, carved from solid rock and furnished with obvious care, that Marcus found the documents that changed everything he thought he understood about the operation. Heinrich Steinberg had been a professor of art history at the University of Vienna before the war, but that was only part of his story. Hidden in a wall, safe that had been left open deliberately, Marcus realized he discovered a collection of letters, photographs, and personal documents that revealed the true scope of project preservation. Heinrich hadn't just been a scholar who decided to save some artifacts. He'd been recruited by a coalition that included representatives from the Vatican, the British Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, and several major American universities. The initial funding had come from wealthy American families who understood that the war was destroying centuries of cultural heritage that could never be replaced. The photographs showed the scale of what had been accomplished. Paintings by masters whose work was thought lost forever. Ancient manuscripts that scholars believed had been destroyed in bombing raids. Scientific instruments and research that represented centuries of human knowledge. Personal items, wedding rings, family photographs, children's toys that represented lives cut short by the chaos of war. But Heinrich's personal journal revealed the human cost of what they'd attempted. Entry after entry described the heartbreak of arriving too late to save a library. The frustration of watching bureaucrats destroy artifacts through ignorance. The weight of choosing between saving objects and saving people when resources were limited. One entry, dated March 15, 1946, showed the toll the work was taking. We have saved the Raphael from the bombed church in Milan, but 3 families died in the shelter because we used the transport truck for artwork instead of evacuation. Dr. Weber says, we must think of future generations, that preserving culture is preserving humanity itself. But tonight I cannot stop thinking of the children who will not see tomorrow because we chose paintings over people. Yet they had continued, driven by a vision that went beyond individual tragedies to consider the survival of human civilization itself. Heinrich's final entries, from late 1947, revealed why the operation had ultimately ended. The world is changing faster than we anticipated. The Americans and Russians divide Europe between them, each side claiming ownership of everything within their sphere. Our neutrality is seen as suspicious by both. The Cold War makes our secrecy dangerous, and the establishment of Israel creates new questions about ownership and repatriation that we are not equipped to handle. We have preserved what we could, documented everything with scientific precision. But the time has come to seal the vaults and trust in providence. Perhaps someday, when the world is stable enough for wisdom to triumph over politics, someone will continue what we started. Until then, let the mountain keep our secrets safe. Marcus sat in Heinrich's chair, surrounded by evidence of the greatest cultural preservation effort in modern history. The scope was overwhelming, billions of dollars worth of art, artifacts, and knowledge hidden away for over 70 years, waiting for someone to decide their fate. He thought about Heinrich's words, when the world is stable enough for wisdom to triumph over politics. Was the world ready now? Was he ready? What gave him the right to make decisions about treasures that belonged to humanity itself? His satellite communicator buzzed with an incoming message from Sarah. Legal team says You need to contact authorities as soon as possible. If what you found is real, multiple government agencies need to know. This could be international. Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Once he made that call, everything would change. Investigators would descend on the castle, lawyers would argue over ownership, governments would stake claims. The quiet mountain sanctuary Heinrich had created would become a circus of competing interests and political maneuvering. But Sarah was right. He couldn't handle this alone. Whatever Heinrich Steinberg and his team had preserved belonged to the world, not to one disabled veteran who'd bought a castle with borrowed money. Still, he wanted to see how deep the tunnels actually went before he opened this Pandora's box. The maps showed at least 2 more levels below the research area, marked only as primary storage and deep archive. If he was going to turn Heinrich's life's work over to government bureaucrats, he wanted to understand exactly what he was giving them. The tracks continued downward through a passage so well engineered it could have been built yesterday instead of 70 years ago. Emergency lighting fixtures ran along both walls, dark now but clearly designed to illuminate the entire route. The rails were embedded in concrete, with proper drainage systems to prevent water damage. As Marcus descended, he noticed the air getting warmer and drier. Wherever these tracks led, the facility was designed to protect its contents from any environmental threat. After another quarter mile, the passage opened into what Heinrich's maps had marked as the primary storage level. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The chamber was enormous, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. But it wasn't the size that stunned him, it was the organization. Row upon row of climate-controlled storage containers stretched across a floor in perfect military precision, each one labeled with detailed inventory information. This wasn't haphazard storage. This was a professional archive that belonged in the world's greatest museums. Marcus opened one of the containers at random, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, nestled in custom foam padding, lay a collection of ancient Greek pottery. Each piece was photographed, catalogued, and accompanied by detailed provenance documentation, showing exactly when it was acquired, from whom, and why it needed to be preserved. Another container held medieval manuscripts, their illuminated pages as bright as the day they were created, preserved in climate-controlled perfection. A third contained scientific instruments from the Renaissance, astrolabes, telescopes, calculating devices maintained with museum-quality care. But it was the inventory system that truly revealed Heinrich's genius. Every container was cross-referenced with detailed records showing not just what was inside, but who it had belonged to before the war, how it had been acquired, and where it should eventually be returned. This wasn't just preservation, it was preparation for the greatest repatriation effort in human history. Marcus moved through the storage level methodically, sampling containers from different sections. Religious artifacts from destroyed synagogues and churches, scientific research from universities that had been bombed or occupied, personal collections from families who had been forced to flee with nothing, art from private collections and public museums alike, all carefully documented and preserved. The scale was beyond anything he could have imagined. According to the inventory sheets he found, this level alone contained over 30,000 individual items. Conservative estimates of value, based on comparable pieces he'd seen in museums, suggested worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But several items appeared to be literally priceless artifacts that scholars had thought lost forever. Yet Heinrich had preserved not just the objects, but the information needed to reunite them with their rightful owners or their descendants. Banking records, insurance documents, family histories, ownership papers, the bureaucratic foundation that would allow every single item to be properly returned to where it belonged. This wasn't just a treasure vault, it was history's greatest lost and found operation, waiting for someone with the courage to begin reuniting people with their past. But Marcus still hadn't reached the deepest level. The tracks continued downward, and Heinrich's maps showed one final chamber, marked simply as Deep Archive. Whatever was down there had been important enough to require the most protection, the deepest burial, the most careful preservation. The final descent took him another 100 feet into the mountain, following tracks that curved through passages carved with even greater precision than the levels above. Engineering was flawless: proper ventilation, drainage systems that would prevent water damage, structural supports that could withstand earthquakes or bombing. This was work that would challenge modern construction techniques, accomplished with 1940s technology. At the bottom, Marcus found himself in Heinrich Steinberg's masterpiece. The Deep Archive wasn't just a storage chamber, it was a cathedral to human knowledge. The ceiling soared 40 feet above his head, supported by stone arches that belonged in the greatest architectural achievements of history. But the space wasn't empty. Instead, it was filled with the most sophisticated preservation system Marcus had ever seen. Climate-controlled chambers lined the walls, each one designed for specific types of materials. Manuscripts in temperature-controlled cases. Paintings in atmospheres of neutral gas to prevent degradation. Metal objects in humidity-free environments. Scientific specimens in preservation solutions that had kept them perfect for decades. But it was the central area that took his breath away. Here, Heinrich had created something unprecedented: a complete archive of human civilization's most precious knowledge, documents that recorded scientific breakthroughs, artistic techniques that had been thought lost, religious texts that preserved spiritual traditions, personal accounts that recorded individual experiences of historical events. And at the center of it all, a single desk where Heinrich had compiled his final gift to the world, a complete index of everything Project Preservation had accomplished. Names of families whose treasures had been saved. Locations of items that belonged in specific museums. Contact information for scholars who had been searching for lost research. Financial records that could be used to provide compensation where objects couldn't be returned. Marcus opened Heinrich's final ledger, written in the old professor's careful handwriting. The last entry was dated December 21st, 1947. We have accomplished something unprecedented in human history, by conservative estimate, accounting only for items whose provenance and value can be definitively established. Project Preservation has saved cultural heritage worth more than $215 million in current dollars. But the true value cannot be measured in money. We have preserved the irreplaceable memories of thousands of families, the cultural heritage of dozens of nations, and knowledge that would have been lost forever. The world is not ready for this responsibility. The Cold War makes neutrality impossible, and politics threatens to destroy what we have built. But I believe that someday, someone will come who understands that preservation is not about ownership, it is about stewardship. May whoever finds this understand the sacred trust they now carry. May they have the wisdom to reunite these treasures with their rightful owners and the courage to resist those who would exploit what we have protected. To you, unknown guardian of our work, I leave this charge. Let no artifact leave this mountain until its story is known, its owner identified, and its return accomplished with honor. What we could not finish, perhaps you can complete. Heinrich Steinberg, final entry. Marcus sat in the Deep Archive, surrounded by the life's work of a man he'd never met, but was beginning to understand with profound respect. Heinrich Steinberg hadn't been a treasure hunter or a war profiteer. He'd been a guardian, protecting humanity's cultural heritage until the world was stable enough to reclaim it properly. Now that responsibility belonged to Marcus, and tomorrow he would have to decide whether he was strong enough to carry it. As he made his way back through the tunnel system toward the surface, Marcus's mind reeled with the magnitude of what he'd discovered. $215 million in documented treasures. Thousands of items, waiting to be returned to families who had given them up for lost, knowledge that could reshape understanding of history, art, and science. But more than that, he'd inherited Heinrich's vision, that some things are too precious to be owned by individuals or governments, that true stewardship means protecting treasures until they can be returned to their rightful place in the world. The question now was whether one disabled veteran with $800 and a borrowed castle could accomplish what Heinrich Steinberg's sophisticated international network had been forced to abandon. Standing in his great hall as darkness fell over the mountains, Marcus looked out at a world that had no idea what lay beneath the Colorado peaks. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to contact the authorities, as Sarah insisted, or find another way to honor Heinrich's legacy without letting bureaucrats and politicians destroy what 7 decades of secrecy had protected. Heinrich had trusted the future to bring someone who would understand the weight of preservation over profit. As Marcus locked the hidden passage behind him, he silently promised the old professor that his life's work wouldn't be lost to greed or government indifference. The real test of Marcus Sullivan's character was about to begin. Marcus emerged from the underground archive as the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, his mind reeling from what he'd discovered in Heinrich's deep archive. The final ledger entry, $215 million in documented cultural treasures, felt surreal even as he held the proof in his hands. But it was Heinrich's final charge that weighed most heavily: to reunite these artifacts with their rightful owners and resist those who would exploit what Project Preservation had protected. He sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the castle silhouetted against the purple sky. Tomorrow, he would have to make the calls Sarah had insisted on. The FBI, maybe Interpol, probably the State Department. Once he did, this quiet mountain would explode with investigators, journalists, and lawyers. The secret Heinrich had protected for over 70 years would become international news. But tonight, he wanted to understand exactly what he was about to unleash on the world. Back in Denver, Marcus spread Heinrich's maps across his small kitchen table and began calculating. According to the preservation records, the facility contained over 50,000 individual items spanning 7 centuries of human civilization. Conservative estimates of value, based on similar pieces he'd researched online, suggested a total worth that boggled the mind. The Raphael painting documented in Container A74 had been missing since 1943, last seen in a Milan church before Allied bombing destroyed the building. Art historians considered it one of the master's lost works, potentially worth $50 million alone. The Stradivarius violin in the Container B21 was one of only 600 known instruments by the master craftsman, valued at over $15 million. The collection of Dead Sea Scroll fragments in the Deep Archive represented some of the earliest known biblical texts, literally priceless to scholars and religious communities worldwide. But it was Heinrich's personal journal that revealed the most staggering numbers. In his methodical way, the old professor had attempted to calculate not just the monetary value, but the cultural impact of what Project Preservation had accomplished. By conservative estimate, accounting only for items whose provenance and value can be definitively established, the total worth of materials preserved exceeds $215 million in current dollars. However, this represents only the quantifiable portion. Items of historical significance, without market comparisons, scientific research that advances human knowledge, and personal artifacts that provide closure to grieving families cannot be assigned monetary value. The true worth of our work will be measured not in dollars, but in the restoration of human heritage to those who thought it lost forever. $215 million. Marcus stared at the number until it stopped feeling real. He owned, or at least controlled, one of the largest private collections in human history. Accidentally. For $800 borrowed from his sister. But as he read deeper into Heinrich's documentation, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. This wasn't just about money or even historical artifacts. Heinrich's team had preserved the last physical connections thousands of families had to relatives murdered in the Holocaust, scientific research that could advance medical knowledge, religious texts that preserved spiritual traditions on the verge of extinction, art that represented the pinnacle of human creativity, and according to Heinrich's correspondence, other people knew about it. His phone rang. Sarah, did you go back there today? Yes. Marcus, I've been making calls. The legal team is concerned, really concerned. You need to contact the authorities immediately. Like tonight. If someone else finds out about this before you report it officially, it could look like you were trying to hide something. I know. I'm going to call in the morning. Why not tonight? Marcus looked at Heinrich's journal, at the photographs of refugees clutching suitcases, at the careful documentation of lives destroyed and treasures saved. Because I want one more night to understand what Heinrich was really doing before the circus starts. Marcus, I'm worried. If what you're describing is real, if there's really that much valuable stuff hidden there, other people are going to want it. People who won't care about returning things to families or preserving history. What do you mean? I mean, the legal team did some research after our call yesterday. Heinrich Steinberg wasn't just some professor who disappeared. He was involved in something the government has been looking for since the war ended. There are files, Marcus. Classified files. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. What kind of files? The kind that suggest you're not the first person to go looking for that castle. He spent the night reading everything Heinrich had left behind, but now with growing paranoia rather than wonder. The scale of project preservation was breathtaking, but Sarah's words echoed in his mind. If the government had files on Heinrich, if other people had been looking for the castle, then his discovery might not be as secret as he'd thought. Heinrich's correspondence from 1946 and 1947 painted a picture of increasing pressure from various government agencies. Letters mentioned interested parties in Washington who wanted the artifacts turned over for proper handling. Others referred to unofficial visitors asking questions in nearby towns. Several messages hinted at surveillance, intimidation, and attempts to force Heinrich to reveal the location of his preservation facility. One letter, from a colleague in Switzerland, was particularly alarming. My dear Heinrich, I must warn you that your American sanctuary may not be as secure as you believe. Certain agencies have taken notice of your work, and their interest appears to be motivated more by asset recovery than cultural preservation. Please consider our earlier offer to relocate the collection to more neutral territory. Heinrich's response was defiant. I will not surrender these treasures to bureaucrats who see dollar signs where they should see human heritage. The families who lost everything deserve better than to have their possessions disappear into government warehouses or private collections. Project preservation will continue until every item can be returned to its rightful owner, regardless of political pressure. The final letters painted a picture of a man under siege. Heinrich wrote about strangers asking questions in the nearby towns, government agents demanding access to his records, and former allies who had been intimidated into cooperation. The decision to seal the facility and disappear hadn't been voluntary, it had been survival. As dawn broke over the mountains, Marcus made his decision. He would contact the authorities, but he would do it on his terms. Heinrich Steinberg had spent 4 years building something extraordinary, only to have it threatened by people who saw assets instead of cultural heritage. Marcus wouldn't let that happen again. He drove back to the castle before making any calls, wanting to document everything himself before anyone else got involved. If he was going to turn Heinrich's life's work over to government agencies, he wanted a complete record of what he was giving them. The morning was crystal clear, the kind of Colorado day that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Marcus parked outside the castle and began unloading equipment, professional cameras, digital scanners, laptop computers, portable lighting. If the world was going to rediscover Heinrich's treasure, it would be done right. He was setting up his equipment in the Great Hall when he heard the sound of engines, multiple engines, coming up the mountain road fast despite the treacherous conditions. Marcus stepped outside and felt his blood run cold. 3 black SUVs were climbing the winding road toward the castle, moving with the confidence of vehicles that had made this trip before. Behind them came a large van with government plates, the kind used by federal agencies for transporting equipment or personnel. This wasn't a casual visit from local law enforcement. Marcus grabbed his satellite communicator and sent a quick message to Sarah. Trouble coming. Multiple government vehicles approaching castle. If something happens to me, everything is documented in the facility below. The SUVs pulled into the castle's courtyard in a formation that looked suspiciously military. Men in dark suits stepped out, their breath visible in the cold air, their movements coordinated like a tactical team. The last vehicle to arrive was different, a sedan with diplomatic plates and windows tinted so dark they looked black. From the sedan stepped a woman Marcus recognized from news coverage, Director Patricia Hammond of the FBI's Art Crime Team. She approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge of complicated situations, flanked by agents carrying equipment cases and electronic gear. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, extending her hand with a professional smile. "I'm Director Hammond. We need to talk." Marcus shook her hand, trying to keep his expression neutral while his mind raced. "About what?" "About the Steinberg collection." Her smile was warmer now, but her eyes remained calculating. "We've been looking for it for over 70 years. The weight of those words settled on Marcus like a physical force. The FBI hadn't just learned about Heinrich's treasure from his phone calls yesterday. They'd been hunting for it since it was hidden, which meant other people knew about it too. People who might not be as interested in cultural preservation as they were in cultural profit. Director Hammond gestured toward the castle entrance. "Shall we discuss this inside? We have quite a lot to cover, and I'm afraid time may be more limited than you realize." As they walked toward the massive doors, Marcus noticed that Hammond's team was already spreading out around the property, some carrying sophisticated electronic equipment, others photographing everything in sight. This wasn't just a conversation, it was the beginning of an operation. And Marcus was starting to suspect he was about to lose control of Heinrich's legacy before he'd even fully understood it. "Mr. Sullivan," Hammond continued as they entered the Great Hall, "how much do you know about Professor Heinrich Steinberg?" "Just what I've read in his papers. He was trying to preserve artifacts from the war." Hammond nodded slowly. "That's accurate, as far as it goes. Professor Steinberg was indeed involved in cultural preservation. He was also part of one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of World War II. Marcus felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet. "Intelligence operations. Operation Bernhard. Mr. Sullivan, have you heard of it?" He shook his head. The Nazis planned to destabilize the American and British economies by flooding them with counterfeit currency. Professor Steinberg was recruited by Allied intelligence to track and recover the printing plates, the paper stocks, and the finished counterfeit bills before they could be distributed. Hammond moved through the Great Hall with practiced ease, examining details with the eye of someone who'd studied this place extensively. What Professor Steinberg discovered was that the Nazis were using stolen art and cultural artifacts as collateral for currency trades with neutral countries. Swiss banks, Spanish collectors, even some American institutions were accepting stolen masterpieces in exchange for hard currency that funded the war effort. So Heinrich was trying to stop that. Initially, yes, but the operation evolved into something much larger. As Allied forces advanced and Nazi resistance crumbled, Professor Steinberg realized that millions of cultural artifacts were at risk of disappearing into private collections, black market sales, or simple destruction. Project Preservation became a massive recovery effort, but one that operated outside official channels. Hammond paused at the fireplace, running her hand along the carved stone mantel. "The problem, Mr. Sullivan, is that several of the items recovered by Professor Steinberg were claimed by multiple parties after the war. Families who lost everything wanted their heirlooms back. Museums wanted their collections restored. And several Allied governments had very specific opinions about what should happen to assets recovered from Nazi hordes." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. "Are you saying Heinrich was a criminal?" "Not at all," Hammond replied quickly. "Professor Steinberg was a patriot who found himself caught between competing claims for ownership. Rather than surrender the artifacts to lengthy legal battles that might last decades, he chose to preserve them until rightful ownership could be definitively established." She gestured toward the cellar door, which Marcus realized her team had already located and opened. "The question now, Mr. Sullivan, is what happens to Heinrich's collection. You've legally purchased the property, which gives you certain rights. But the contents of this facility represent cultural heritage that belongs to people all over the world." Marcus watched agents setting up equipment in the cellar entrance. "What are you suggesting?" "Partnership," Hammond said. "The FBI has resources you don't: legal authority, preservation experts, connections with museums and cultural institutions worldwide. We can ensure that these artifacts are properly preserved and returned to their rightful owners. And in return," Hammond's smile became more genuine, "in return, you become part of the greatest cultural repatriation effort in modern history. Instead of one man struggling with an impossible responsibility, you work with a team dedicated to reuniting families with their heritage." It sounded reasonable. It sounded official and proper and legal. But something in Hammond's manner reminded Marcus of the elderly man at the auction, too polished, too prepared, too certain they knew what was best. What happens next will shake Marcus to his core, reveal hidden agendas that threaten everything Heinrich worked to protect, and force him to choose between safety and the sacred trust he's inherited. Stay tuned to see how he responds to pressure that could destroy Heinrich's legacy forever. If you're enjoying this incredible story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. "I'd like some time to think about it," Marcus said carefully. "Of course, but Mr. Sullivan, you should know that several other parties are aware of your discovery: private collectors, international art dealers, even some organizations with significantly less legitimate interests than ours." As if on cue, one of Hammond's agents approached with a tablet showing aerial photographs. "Director, we've identified at least 3 surveillance teams positioned around the mountain. Private vehicles, professional equipment, long-range optics. They've been monitoring the access roads since yesterday." Hammond's expression darkened. "Mr. Sullivan, those are exactly the people I was warning you about. They're not interested in returning stolen art to its rightful owners. They're interested in profit, pure and simple, and they have significantly fewer scruples about how they acquire what they want." Marcus felt walls closing in around him. He'd thought he had time to figure out the right approach to Heinrich's collection. Instead, he was caught between federal agents who wanted to take control and private interests who might simply take the treasures by force. "Director Hammond," he said slowly, "I appreciate the FBI's concern for these artifacts. But Heinrich Steinberg preserved this collection for over 70 years without government protection. He managed to keep it safe from Nazis, communists, and everyone else who wanted to claim it. Maybe he did that by being very careful about who he trusted." Hammond's professional smile slipped slightly. "Mr. Sullivan, this isn't 1947. The world has changed. Legal frameworks exist now for handling cultural property disputes. The FBI has successfully repatriated billions of dollars worth of stolen art to museums and families worldwide. And how much of that art ended up in private collections owned by people who donated to the right political campaigns?" Marcus asked quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Hammond's agents stopped what they were doing and looked toward their director. For a moment, the only sound was the echo of Marcus's question bouncing off ancient stone walls. "Mr. Sullivan," Hammond said, her voice carrying a new edge, "I'm trying to help you navigate a very complex situation. But if you choose to obstruct a federal investigation into stolen cultural property, your legal situation becomes significantly more complicated." Marcus felt something snap inside him, the same feeling he'd had in Afghanistan, when politicians in air-conditioned offices made decisions that got soldiers killed. The same feeling he'd had at the VA when administrators who'd never worn a uniform decided what benefits wounded veterans deserved. "Director Hammond," he said, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned as a sergeant leading men into combat. "This is my property. Those documents and artifacts are my responsibility now. If the FBI wants to investigate, you can get a warrant. If you want a partnership, you can make a formal proposal through my attorney. But right now, you're on private property without permission, and I'm asking you to leave." The silence stretched until Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the stone hall. Then Hammond smiled, a different expression this time, one that suggested she'd just confirmed something she'd suspected. "Very well, Mr. Sullivan. We'll handle this through official channels." She gestured to her agents. "Pack it up. We'll be back with proper documentation." As the FBI team gathered their equipment and filed out of the castle, Hammond paused at the entrance. "Mr. Sullivan, Heinrich Steinberg was a brilliant man who dedicated his life to preserving cultural heritage. He also died alone and forgotten, hiding in these mountains, because he didn't trust anyone enough to share the burden he carried." She looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I'd hate to see you make the same choice he did, especially when there are people out there who won't be as patient as we've been." After they left, Marcus stood alone in the Great Hall, surrounded by 70 years of preserved history and the echo of barely concealed threats. Through the windows, he could see black vehicles disappearing down the mountain road, but he knew they'd be back. And next time, they'd have warrants, court orders, and legal authority he couldn't refuse. He had maybe 48 hours to figure out a better plan. 48 hours to decide how to honor Heinrich's legacy without becoming its final victim. His satellite communicator buzzed with an urgent message from Sarah. "FBI contacted our law firm 1 hour ago. They already had extensive files on the property and Professor Steinberg. Marcus, I think you've walked into something much bigger than a simple treasure discovery. Call me immediately." Marcus looked around the great hall one more time, at the hand-carved beams and ancient stonework that had sheltered Heinrich's secret for decades. Tomorrow, everything would change. Government agencies would fight over jurisdiction, private collectors would make increasingly aggressive offers, and the media would turn his quiet mountain into a circus. But tonight, he still controlled Heinrich's legacy. Tonight, he could still make decisions based on what was right rather than what was expedient. Standing in the silence of his castle, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hiding Heinrich's collection from the world, he would reveal it to everyone at once. If powerful interests wanted to control the artifacts, they'd have to do it in public, with the whole world watching. He spent the evening in Heinrich's office, reading through the old professor's correspondence and research notes. Heinrich had maintained relationships with scholars, refugees, and cultural institutions around the world. Many of those people were still alive, still searching for family treasures, still hoping to find artwork and documents thought lost forever. Marcus began making phone calls. The first was to Dr. Rachel Goldman at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Marcus explained who he was and what he'd found, reading directly from Heinrich's inventory records. When he mentioned the collection of personal items from Jewish families, Dr. Goldman's voice broke. "Mr. Sullivan," she whispered, "we've been searching for those family collections for 70 years. Some of those items are the only physical connections people have to relatives who died in the camps. The families have never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. Would you help me return them to the right families?" "Help you, Mr. Sullivan? What you're describing is the most important Holocaust repatriation discovery since the war ended. Of course we'll help. When can we see the documentation?" Second call was to Dr. Antonio Mendez at UNESCO, the United Nations organization responsible for protecting cultural heritage worldwide. Marcus described Heinrich's preservation methods and the scope of the collection. Dr. Mendez listened in growing amazement. "Professor Steinberg," he said slowly. "We have records of Heinrich Steinberg from our early files. UNESCO tried to locate him in the 1950s. We wanted to honor his preservation work and learn from his methods, but he'd vanished completely. Would UNESCO support an international effort to return these artifacts to their owners? Mr. Sullivan, what you're describing would be UNESCO's dream project, cultural repatriation on this scale. With proper documentation and scientific preservation, it would set a precedent for how the world handles stolen heritage for decades to come. The third call was to James Mitchell, the senior investigative reporter at The Washington Post, who specialized in art, crime, and cultural heritage stories. Marcus arranged to meet him the next morning, offering full documentation and access to the facility. By midnight, Marcus had contacted representatives from 12 countries, 18 museums, 6 universities, and 3 major international news organizations. He'd sent encrypted copies of Heinrich's inventory records to all of them, along with detailed photographs and an invitation to witness the formal opening of the Steinberg collection to international oversight. He wasn't just revealing Heinrich's treasure. He was creating a media event that would make it impossible for any single group to claim control over the artifacts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dr. Goldman caught the first flight from Washington. UNESCO promised to send a full cultural protection team. The Washington Post assigned 3 reporters and 2 photographers to the story. Museums from London, Berlin, Vienna, and Tel Aviv sent representatives. Family members whose heritage might be in Heinrich's collection began calling from around the world, and at 3 a.m, Director Hammond called back, "Mr. Sullivan." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "What you're planning is extremely dangerous. Some of these artifacts may be evidence in ongoing criminal investigations. Others could be subject to international legal disputes that take decades to resolve. You're opening a Pandora's box that could destroy everything Professor Steinberg worked to protect." "Director Hammond," Marcus replied. "Heinrich Steinberg spent 4 years saving these items from destruction. He documented everything precisely so they could be returned to their rightful owners. That's exactly what I'm going to do, through proper legal channels." "No," Marcus said firmly, "through transparent channels. The world is going to see exactly what Heinrich preserved, and the world is going to decide what happens to it, not bureaucrats in back rooms, not private collectors with government connections, not agencies with classified agendas. The world." "Mr. Sullivan, you're making a serious mistake. There are national security implications you don't understand, international agreements you could be violating, people who will kill to get their hands on what you found." Marcus thought about Heinrich's final letter, about the old professor's faith that someday someone would come who understood that preservation was about stewardship, not ownership. Director Hammond, Heinrich Steinberg, trusted the future to bring the right person at the right time. Maybe that person isn't a government agent or a museum director or a politician. Maybe it's just someone who believes that some things are too precious to be owned by anyone. 3 days later, the access road to Marcus's castle looked like a small city. Media trucks lined the mountain highway from the valley floor to the castle gates. Scholars from around the world had set up temporary research stations in the nearest town. Security teams hired by various museums and cultural organizations established checkpoints to ensure the artifact's safety. Marcus stood at the castle's main entrance, wearing his dress uniform from the army, the only formal clothes he owned that seemed appropriate for what he was about to do. Behind him, representatives from 23 countries waited for the first official tour of Heinrich Steinberg's preservation facility. Dr. Goldman stood beside him, tears already streaming down her face as she looked at Heinrich's maps and documentation displayed for the international delegation. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, "there are families who have been searching for these items for 70 years, children who have only heard descriptions of their grandparents' wedding rings, their families' religious artifacts, their ancestors' letters." Marcus thought about Heinrich's final charge, about trusting that someone would come who understood the sacred nature of what Project Preservation had accomplished. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "Heinrich Steinberg saved these artifacts because he believed they belonged to the world, not to the people who stole them or the governments who claimed them. Today, we begin the work of returning them to their families, their communities, their nations. He opened the hidden passage to Heinrich's preservation facility, not as its sole guardian, but as the first step in fulfilling Heinrich's dream of reuniting humanity with its lost heritage. But even as cameras flashed and scholars gasped at the treasures revealed, Marcus noticed the black SUVs parked at the edge of the crowd. Director Hammond stood beside one of them, speaking quietly into a phone, her expression promising that this was far from over. Heinrich Steinberg's treasure was finally revealed to the world. But the real battle for its future was just beginning. The day of the official revelation arrived, faster than anyone expected, but Marcus had never felt more ready for anything in his life. The mountain road to his castle was lined with vehicles from around the world, UNESCO trucks, museum vans, media equipment trailers, and cars bearing diplomatic plates from a dozen nations. What had once been the most isolated place Marcus could imagine was now the center of international attention. He stood in the great hall at dawn, before anyone else arrived, wearing his dress uniform and looking around at the stone walls that had become more than shelter, they had become his purpose. In 3 months, he'd gone from a broken veteran, questioning whether his life had any meaning, to the guardian of humanity's greatest cultural preservation effort. But today wasn't about him. Today was about fulfilling Heinrich Steinberg's dream. Dr. Rachel Goldman from the Holocaust Memorial Museum was the first to arrive, carrying a briefcase filled with documentation that families had been submitting for 70 years, descriptions of lost heirlooms, photographs of jewelry and artifacts, letters describing the last time they'd seen their family treasures before the world went mad. "Marcus," she said, using his first name now after 3 days of intense preparation, "I need you to understand what today means to these families. Some of them are third-generation survivors who grew up hearing stories about their grandparents' wedding rings, their great-grandfathers' prayer books, their family's silver that had been passed down for centuries." She opened her briefcase and showed him a photograph of an elderly woman holding a faded picture. "This is Sarah Hoffman. She's 87, lives in Miami." The picture she's holding shows her mother wearing a necklace that was stolen from their home in Vienna in 1938. According to Heinrich's inventory, that necklace is in container C47. Marcus looked at the photograph, a young woman in 1930s clothing, smiling, wearing an ornate silver necklace that caught the light like captured stars. "We'll find it," he said quietly. "Marcus, that necklace is probably worth $50,000 at auction. But to Sarah Hoffman, it's the last physical connection she has to a mother she watched die in a concentration camp. When we return it to her, we're not just giving back jewelry. We're giving back memory, identity, proof that her family existed and mattered." By mid-morning, the castle courtyard looked like a small United Nations assembly. Dr. Antonio Mendez had arrived with a UNESCO preservation team equipped with the most sophisticated artifact handling equipment Marcus had ever seen. Representatives from the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Smithsonian Institution stood alongside scholars from universities in 7 countries. But it was the families that affected Marcus most deeply. They had come from around the world, elderly survivors, middle-aged, children of refugees, young adults who knew their heritage only through stories passed down through generations. Each of them carried hope that had survived decades of disappointment. James Mitchell from the Washington Post approached Marcus as he prepared for the formal presentation. "Mr. Sullivan, this is the biggest cultural story of the decade, maybe the century. Are you sure you're ready for what's about to happen? Once we publish this, your life will never be the same." Marcus looked around at the international delegation, at the families clutching old photographs, at the scholars who had dedicated their lives to preserving human heritage. "James, my life changed the moment I found Heinrich's letter. Everything since then has just been figuring out how to live up to what he trusted me to do." At exactly noon, Marcus stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. Representatives from 23 nations, journalists from major international publications, and families who had traveled thousands of miles all turned toward him. For a moment, the weight of their attention was overwhelming. 3 months ago, he'd been nobody, a disabled veteran whose own sister worried he was giving up on life. Now he stood before the world's leading experts on cultural heritage, about to reveal the greatest preservation discovery in modern history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "my name is Marcus Sullivan, and until recently, I was just a guy trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. 3 months ago, I bought this castle for $800 because I thought I needed a project. What I found instead was a sacred trust left by Professor Heinrich Steinberg, a man who understood that some things are too precious to be owned by governments, too important to be sold to collectors, and too meaningful to families to be hidden away forever. He gestured toward the castle entrance. Heinrich Steinberg and his team spent 4 years during and after World War II preserving over 50,000 cultural artifacts that would otherwise have been lost forever. Not to make money, not to build a private collection, but to keep them safe until they could be returned to the families and communities they belonged to. Marcus paused. Looking out at the faces before him, scholars who had spent their careers searching for lost knowledge, families who had never stopped hoping to recover their heritage, officials who understood the diplomatic complexity of what he was proposing. Today, we don't just open a vault, we begin the largest cultural repatriation effort in human history. These artifacts will be returned to their rightful owners. Their stories will be preserved, and Heinrich's vision of protecting human heritage will finally be completed. He stepped aside and opened the hidden passage to Heinrich's preservation facility. "Welcome to the Steinberg Collection." The response was immediate and overwhelming. As the international delegation descended into the preservation chambers, gasps of amazement echoed through the tunnels. Dr. Mendez from UNESCO stopped in front of the first storage level and actually sat down, overwhelmed by the scope and organization of what Heinrich had accomplished. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The preservation methods, the documentation, the scale, this is more sophisticated than most modern museums." Dr. Goldman was examining the inventory records with tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, these records are perfect. Every item documented, every family identified, every piece cross-referenced with historical records." Heinrich didn't just save these things, he made sure they could be reunited with their owners. But it was the reaction of the families that truly revealed the impact of what Heinrich had preserved. Maria Santos, whose grandfather's scientific instruments were documented in Section D2, broke down when she saw the inventory listing. "My grandfather was a professor in Barcelona," she sobbed. "The fascists destroyed his laboratory, but we never knew what happened to his instruments. He died thinking his life's work was gone forever." Over the next several hours, as scholars and families explored the preservation chambers, Marcus began to understand the true magnitude of what he'd inherited. This wasn't just about returning stolen property, it was about healing wounds that had festered for 70 years, restoring identity to people who thought they'd lost everything, and proving that human goodness could triumph over the forces that tried to erase history. What happens next will transform not just Marcus's life, but an entire community, proving that when we choose to share our treasures rather than hoard them, we create something far more valuable than money could ever buy. Stay tuned to see how one man's decision to honor a promise changes everything. If you're enjoying this incredible story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The weeks that followed the revelation were unlike anything Marcus could have imagined. The castle became an international cultural heritage site, with scholars working around the clock to identify, preserve, and research Heinrich's collection. Every artifact was photographed from multiple angles, catalogued with scientific precision, and cross-referenced with databases of missing cultural property from around the world. But more than the scholarly work, it was the personal stories that transformed the mountain community and Marcus himself. The first major repatriation ceremony took place just 2 weeks after the public opening. Sarah Hoffman, the 87-year-old woman Dr. Goldman had told him about, flew from Miami to Colorado to reclaim her mother's necklace. Marcus was there when Dr. Goldman opened container C47 and carefully extracted the silver necklace that had been photographed in Vienna more than 80 years ago. Sarah took it in hands that shook with age and emotion, holding it up to the light exactly as her mother had in the old photograph. "She wore this on her wedding day," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "It was the last thing she gave me before they took her away. I thought I'd never see it again." She looked at Marcus with eyes full of gratitude and something deeper validation that her family's story mattered, that their memory had been preserved with care and respect. "Thank you for keeping Heinrich's promise," she said. "Thank you for proving that someone still cared." The ceremony was covered by international media, but Marcus refused most interview requests. This wasn't about him. It was about the families finding their heritage, and Heinrich finally receiving recognition for his extraordinary work. Similar ceremonies followed almost weekly. A historian from Prague was reunited with medieval manuscripts from the university library that was bombed in 1945. A family in Berlin reclaimed their ancestors' collection of scientific instruments that had been confiscated by the Nazis and thought lost forever. A young artist from Tel Aviv discovered that Heinrich had preserved her great-grandmother's paintings work that had been hidden in a synagogue basement and rescued just before the building was destroyed. Each reunion strengthened Marcus's conviction that he'd made the right choice. Heinrich had been right to trust that someday someone would come who understood that preservation was about stewardship, not ownership. But the transformation went beyond individual families. The castle complex became a model for international cooperation in cultural preservation. UNESCO established it as a training center where museum professionals from around the world could learn Heinrich's preservation techniques. Universities sent graduate students to study the documentation methods that had made such precise repatriation possible. The facility became a living testament to what could be accomplished when people worked together to preserve human heritage. The local community was transformed as well. The small mountain town that had been struggling economically suddenly found itself at the center of international attention. Hotels filled with visiting scholars and family members attending repatriation ceremonies. Restaurants stayed busy, serving visitors from around the world. Local artisans began creating replicas of some of Heinrich's preserved artifacts, with proceeds supporting the ongoing preservation work. Marcus hired local residents to help with the massive cataloging effort. Emma Chen, a recent college graduate who'd returned home because she couldn't find work in her field, became the facility's lead digital archivist. Tom Rodriguez, a veteran who'd been struggling with his own post-war adjustment, found purpose managing security for the precious artifacts. Sarah Whitfield, a retired teacher, organized the volunteer program that helped families research their heritage claims. The economic impact was significant, but the cultural transformation was even more profound. The community had found a shared purpose that went beyond individual survival. They were part of something that mattered to the entire world. Marcus himself changed in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The lonely, purposeless veteran who'd bought a castle on impulse had become the director of the most important cultural heritage project of the modern era. But more than that, he'd discovered something he'd lost in the war: the belief that individual actions could make a meaningful difference in the world. The nightmares that had plagued him since Afghanistan began to fade, replaced by dreams about families reunited with their heritage, about knowledge preserved for future generations, about Heinrich's vision finally being fulfilled. The prosthetic leg that had seemed like a constant reminder of what he'd lost became simply a part of who he was, someone who'd been broken but had found a way to help heal others. 6 months after the collection's public revelation, Marcus stood in Heinrich's former office, now transformed into a modern research center. Through the windows, he could see scholars from around the world working in the preservation chambers, carefully preparing artifacts for return to their families. On his desk sat a letter that had arrived that morning, forwarded by the Holocaust Memorial Museum. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, I am 87 years old, and I never expected to see my mother's jewelry again. When I saw the photograph of her necklace in the newspaper, I cried for 3 days, not from sadness, but from joy. Thank you for keeping Heinrich's promise to return what was stolen. Thank you for proving that good people still exist in the world. My mother would have been so proud to know that her treasures were protected by someone who understood their true value. With eternal gratitude, Rebecca Hoffman. Marcus carefully filed the letter with the hundreds of others that arrived each week. Thank you notes from families around the world, research requests from universities, and offers of support from people who believed in Heinrich's vision of preservation over profit. His phone rang. Sarah. How are you feeling? She asked. Marcus looked around Heinrich's office. At the maps showing artifacts successfully returned to their owners, at the photographs of families reunited with their heritage, at the research publications crediting Heinrich's work with advancing human knowledge. Like I finally understand what Heinrich meant about sacred trusts, he said. Any regrets about not just keeping quiet and selling everything privately? You could have been worth hundreds of millions. Marcus laughed. A sound that came easier now than it had in years. Sarah, Heinrich's collection was worth $215 million. But what we're doing with it? That's worth more than money can measure. Through his office window, Marcus watched a group of teenagers from the local high school helping to carefully pack artifacts for shipment to a museum in Austria. One of them was Evelyn Chen, Emma's younger sister, who'd volunteered every weekend for 4 months, learning about cultural preservation and helping to reunite other families with their heritage. Mr. Sullivan, Evelyn called from the doorway. The team from the Vienna Museum is ready to examine the medieval manuscripts. They think some of them might be from the monastery library that was destroyed in 1944. Marcus smiled. Tell them I'll be right there. As he walked through the castle toward the preservation chambers, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been a broken veteran living in a studio apartment, struggling with nightmares and wondering if his life had any purpose beyond mere survival. Now he was the director of the most important cultural repatriation project in modern history, helping to heal wounds that had festered for over 70 years. But more than that, he'd learned something Heinrich Steinberg had understood from the beginning. Preservation isn't about holding on to things. It's about making sure they reach the people who need them most. In the deep archive, Marcus found the team from Vienna carefully examining a collection of illuminated manuscripts that had been thought lost forever. Dr. Elizabeth Weber, the museum's chief curator, looked up with tears in her eyes. Mr. Sullivan, she said, her voice thick with emotion, these are from the Benedictine monastery at Melk. We thought they were destroyed when the Nazis raided the library in 1944. These manuscripts date back to the 12th century. They're the only surviving copies of several medieval texts that scholars thought were lost to history forever. Marcus watched as Dr. Weber and her team photographed each page with reverent care. Heinrich had saved these manuscripts from destruction, preserved them for 70 years, and now they would return to Austria to be shared with scholars around the world, exactly as the old professor had intended. Professor Steinberg would be proud, Dr. Weber said softly. Marcus nodded, thinking about the letter Heinrich had left in the deep archive. I think he knew this day would come. He just needed to make sure the right person was here when it did. That evening, after the scholars and researchers had finished their work for the day, Marcus walked alone through the castle. The great hall was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with purpose, with the knowledge that Heinrich's vision of preservation and repatriation was finally being realized on a scale that exceeded even the old professor's dreams. He stopped at the memorial wall he'd installed near the main entrance. Photographs and stories of the people Heinrich's team had helped during the war, including a picture of Heinrich himself, taken in 1946. The old professor looked tired but determined, a man carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. Below Heinrich's photograph, Marcus had mounted a plaque with the professor's own words, "The true value cannot be measured in money. We have saved the irreplaceable memories of thousands of families the cultural heritage of dozens of nations, and knowledge that would have been lost forever. Marcus touched the plaque gently, then walked to the window overlooking the mountain valley. Snow was beginning to fall, covering the landscape in pristine white. Somewhere down in the preservation chambers, artifacts rescued from the chaos of war waited to continue their journey home to families who had never stopped hoping to see them again. He thought about the 8-year-old girl who had visited last month with her class and asked why people try to destroy beautiful things. Marcus had knelt down to her level and explained that some people think destruction makes them powerful, but they're wrong. Real power comes from protecting what matters, from making sure future generations inherit a world richer than the one we found. The little girl had nodded solemnly, then asked if she could help return treasures to families when she grew up. Marcus had promised her there would always be work for people who understood that some things are too precious to be owned by anyone. A year later, as Marcus stood in the great hall of his castle during the annual Heinrich Steinberg Memorial Ceremony, he was surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the old professor's vision. Families who had recovered their heritage, scholars who had gained access to knowledge thought lost forever, young people who had found careers in cultural preservation, and community members who had discovered purpose in something greater than themselves. The ceremony honored not just Heinrich, but everyone who had worked to fulfill his dream. Dr. Goldman spoke about the hundreds of families who had been reunited with their heritage. Dr. Mendez announced UNESCO's decision to make the Steinberg model the international standard for cultural repatriation. James Mitchell read from his Pulitzer Prize-winning series about the discovery and its impact on how the world approaches stolen cultural property. But it was Emma Chen, the young archivist who had helped digitize Heinrich's entire collection, who captured the true meaning of what they'd accomplished. Professor Steinberg understood something that took the rest of us decades to learn, that the greatest treasures aren't the ones we keep, but the ones we share. Every artifact we return to its family, every piece of knowledge we preserve for future scholars, every young person we inspire to protect human heritage, these are the real treasures. They multiply when we give them away. Marcus thought about those words as the ceremony ended, and people began to drift away into the mountain evening. He'd started this journey as one man trying to figure out what to do with a broken-down castle. He was ending it as part of something that would continue long after he was gone, a community of people dedicated to preserving and sharing the best of human civilization. The castle was no longer just his home, it was a lighthouse, guiding lost treasures back to their families and proving that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long it takes. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we find, but the ones we choose to give back. Marcus Sullivan had bought a castle for $800 and discovered a fortune worth millions. But his real discovery was something Heinrich Steinberg had known all along, that preserving the past is really about protecting the future, and that true wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we're willing to share, because for Marcus and for the thousands of families whose heritage Heinrich saved, the real treasure was never the gold or art or ancient manuscripts. It was the proof that human goodness endures, that some people will risk everything to protect what matters most, and that even in the darkest times, there are guardians working quietly to keep hope alive. The wounded veteran who thought his fighting days were over had found his most important battle, and in honoring Heinrich's legacy, he had discovered his own, showing the world that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from conquering, but from giving back. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to put purpose before profit and trust that doing the right thing is always worth the risk. Some people inherit money, some inherit land, but Marcus Sullivan inherited something far more valuable, the chance to heal the world, one returned treasure at a time. As the snow continued to fall over the Colorado mountains, Marcus Sullivan stood in his castle, not as its owner, but as its steward, protecting treasures that belonged to all humanity. The boy who had once asked his grandfather why bad things happened to good people now knew the answer, because good people exist to make sure those bad things don't have the final word. And in the quiet halls of Heinrich Steinberg's castle, that promise was being kept, one returned treasure at a time. Proving that some stories never end, they just find new guardians willing to carry them forward. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories await you. Click to continue this journey of discovery with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that some promises are worth keeping forever.